The story the ordinary was telling. How the quiet patterns of everyday life were pointing to the gospel all along. For most of this book, we have been paying attention to small things, the kind of objects that fill a life so quietly we rarely stop to consider them. A rocking chair that creaks softly when someone settles into it. A pound cake cooling on the counter. A door rescued from a building that could no longer stand and carried into the house because no one had the heart to throw it away. None of them seemed especially important at first. They were simply part of ordinary life, the familiar tools and habits that accumulate around a person over time. But if you live long enough among ordinary things, you begin to notice that they repeat certain patterns. Worn things still serving long after their first purpose has passed. Fruit that looks too bruised to eat becoming the sweetest bread in the kitchen. Torn fabric gathered into a loom and woven into something stronger than it was before. At first, those patterns seem incidental. The kinds of observations you notice while baking, or gardening, or cleaning out an old building. But the longer you sit with them, the harder it becomes to ignore what they suggest. What looks ruined may not actually be ruined. What looks finished may not actually be finished. And eventually, every reflection like this runs into the same immovable reality. The Christian story does not end in a metaphor. It leads to a cross. The cross was not a poetic symbol to the people who witnessed it. It was an instrument of humiliation and death. Splintered wood and exposed wounds. Slow suffocation beneath the weight of a failing body. Soldiers gambling for a dying man's clothes while the crowd watched. A mother stood close enough to hear her son struggle for breath and could do nothing to stop it. Nothing about that afternoon felt redemptive to the people standing there. The disciples did not stand beneath the cross thinking about salvation. As far as they could see, the story had collapsed. The man they believed to be the Messiah had not taken a throne. He had been executed like a common criminal, and the kingdom they hoped for appeared to have died with him. Scripture tells us that darkness fell over the land that afternoon as though even creation recoiled from what it was witnessing. And if the story had ended there, the world would have understood it perfectly. Because the world already believes that power wins, that violence settles the argument, and that death eventually closes every door. But the story did not end there. 3 days later, before the city had fully awakened, women came to the tomb carrying burial spices. They were not expecting resurrection. They simply came to finish the work of mourning. Instead, they found the stone rolled away and the grave empty. And with it came the message that changed the course of history. Jesus of Nazareth, who had been crucified, was no longer in the tomb. He had risen. The resurrection did not erase the cross. When Christ appeared to his disciples, the wounds were still visible. The scars in his hands remained. Thomas was invited to touch them for himself. Resurrection did not pretend suffering had not happened. It declared that suffering would not have the final word. That difference changes everything. Because the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not simply a miracle that happened long ago. It is the turning point of the human story. Death no longer holds final authority over the world God created. The brokenness we see around us and within us is not the last chapter being written. Which brings us back, strangely enough, to the ordinary things we started with. The rocking chair that keeps moving long after the children have grown. The loaf of bread that only becomes bread after passing through heat. The rag rug, woven from torn pieces that once belonged to something else entirely. None of those explain the gospel, but they do echo it. They whisper the same truth the resurrection declares out loud. God does not abandon what looks ruined. He redeems it. He does not discard what looks worn beyond repair. He restores it. And he does not wait for human lives to become polished and impressive before he begins his work. He begins with what we are, bruised, torn, ordinary. That does not mean the work is finished yet. The world we live in is still marked by the weight of the fall. Graves are still dug, bodies still fail, people still wound one another in ways that take years to heal. But the resurrection has already broken the final power of that story. Because Christ has risen, the brokenness we see around us and within us is not the end of the story being written. Which means the quiet places where we live most of our lives are not insignificant after all. The kitchen table where forgiveness is spoken. The worn Bible opened again after dinner. The small decision to begin again when something has failed. These ordinary moments are not interruptions to the story of redemption. They are where it continues. The same God who raised Christ from the grave is still at work in the world he has not finished restoring, still mending, still weaving, still gathering the torn pieces of ordinary lives and shaping them into something whole. And one day the work will be finished. Scripture promises a day when the risen Christ will return, when death itself will finally be undone, and every broken thing will be restored in full. Until that day, we live in the long middle of the story, the cross behind us, the resurrection already declared, and the quiet work of redemption still unfolding in lives like ours. Which means the small things we notice along the way, the chairs, the bread, the doors, the towels, the tools of everyday life, are not meaningless after all. They are reminders. Reminders that the God who once walked out of a tomb is still at work, still redeeming, still restoring, still making all things new.